Dr. Marcus Halstead sat in the dimly lit control room of the Kepler Research Observatory. The hum of computers and the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, the only sounds that pierced the midnight quiet. He stared at the cascading lines of data on his monitor, his coffee long since gone cold. For weeks, strange signals had been disrupting the routine measurements of deep space radiation. At first, his team had dismissed them as interference or perhaps a malfunction in their equipment. But the signals were persistent, structured. "Marcus, you're still at it?" came the voice of Evelyn Grant, his closest colleague. She entered the room, a weary smile on her face, holding a fresh cup of coffee. He nodded, eyes still glued to the screen. "It's not noise, Evelyn. Look at this." He motioned for her to come closer, pulling up a series of spectrographs. "These aren't random spikes. There's a pattern here. Whatever it is, it's repeating in intervals." Evelyn leaned in, her brow furrowing as she studied the data. "It almost looks biological, like a heartbeat." "Exactly." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by an alert blaring from the speakers. The signals were intensifying, growing more complex. Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard, isolating the new waveforms. This is new. It's almost like it's responding to something." "Responding to what?" Evelyn whispered, a chill creeping into her voice. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. A few hours later, the first object appeared on their instruments. A large, unidentified mass on a collision course with Earth. News of the anomaly quickly spread, and within days, telescopes worldwide confirmed its approach. It was not an asteroid. Its trajectory was too controlled, its speed too consistent. When the object finally entered Earth's atmosphere, its descent was eerily quiet. Marcus and Evelyn watched the live feed from a satellite as the black, oblong structure hurtled toward the Pacific Ocean, its surface gleaming like polished obsidian. It didn't crash so much as it landed, displacing massive amounts of water, but otherwise leaving no visible damage to the planet. The world held its breath. Military forces mobilized, but their weapons seemed irrelevant in the face of something so utterly alien. For 3 days, the object sat in silence, its surface impenetrable to all attempts at analysis. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, a barely perceptible hum. But soon the entire planet could hear it, a chorus of low, haunting whispers that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. People reported headaches, nausea, and an overwhelming sense of unease. Marcus stayed glued to the observatory monitors, tracking the emergence of smaller objects, satellite-like constructs that detached from the main structure and began descending to various points across the globe. Unlike the first object, these were no longer passive. They moved with purpose, landing in remote areas and immediately setting to work. "What are they doing?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "They're building something," Marcus replied grimly, his eyes fixed on the screen. The constructs were tearing apart the environment, trees, rocks, even small animals, fusing organic and inorganic materials into strange pulsating growths. The first reports of the biomechanical creatures came from a village in Siberia. Survivors described horrors that defied explanation, things that crawled, slithered, and marched, their bodies a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and metal. They didn't attack at first, but when a local militia fired on them, the retaliation was swift and brutal. By the time the news reached the observatory, the creatures had already begun spreading. Marcus watched the footage in horror, a man still screaming, being dragged into a writhing mass of tendrils and machinery. When he emerged minutes later, his body was no longer his own. "This isn't an invasion," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "This is assimilation." Evelyn stared at him, her face pale. "If that's true, what do they want with us?" Marcus didn't answer. The whispers seemed louder now, echoing in his mind. The helicopter's rotors chopped through the icy Montana air as it descended toward what was left of the outpost. Dr. Marcus Halstead tightened his grip on the armrest, his breath fogging up the small window as he surveyed the landscape below. What had once been a quiet research facility now lay shrouded in a web of biomechanical growths, pulsing with an eerie dim light. Tendrils stretched across the ground, gripping the remains of vehicles and structures like the roots of some alien tree. "Jesus Christ," Evelyn whispered beside him, clutching a tablet that displayed a live feed from a drone circling the area. The images were worse than anything Marcus had imagined. Bodies, or what remained of them, were fused into the organic metallic constructs, their twisted forms barely recognizable as human. Their faces, if intact, were locked in expressions of perpetual torment. "This is where the survivors said it started," said Captain Reeves, the soldier leading the extraction team. His voice was clipped, professional, but Marcus could see the fear in his eyes. They touched down a few hundred meters from the perimeter of the zone. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the faint, rhythmic vibrations underfoot made Marcus feel as though they were standing on the belly of some slumbering beast. The survivors were huddled in a makeshift shelter, their eyes hollow and their bodies trembling. There were only three, 2 men and a woman, barely coherent after days of exposure to the horrors of the zone. Marcus approached the woman, Sarah, whose half-transformed arm was wrapped in layers of gauze. "It started 3 days ago," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We thought it was just another one of those things, those creatures. But this was different. It wasn't alive. Not really. It was something worse." "What did you see?" Marcus asked softly, his pen poised over a notebook. She shuddered. "It came from the center of the zone. A machine. Or maybe it was alive, I don't know. It looks wrong. It pulls you in. You hear it whispering in your head, telling you it can make you better. And then..." She broke off, staring at her grotesque arm. Marcus's throat tightened. "And then what happens?" Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. "It melts you. Your skin, your bones, your mind. It tears you apart and puts you back together, but you're not the same. You're never the same." The team ventured closer to the center of the zone, leaving the survivors under guard. As they approached the epicenter, the whispers became louder, not audible in the traditional sense, but vibrating through their skulls. "It's here," Evelyn said, stopping dead in her tracks. Before them stood the flesh forge. It was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Towering at least 3 stories high, its structure was an abomination of flesh and metal, pulsating as though alive. Veins of glowing liquid coursed through its semi-organic surface, and from its core emanated a deep, resonant hum. Tendrils extended from its base, dragging in anything within reach: scrap metal, pieces of trees, and sometimes people. The forge's mouth, if it could be called that, was a cavernous opening ringed with rows of jagged, shifting teeth. A man's body was dragged into the maw, his screams abruptly cutting off as the tendrils retracted, pulling him into the machine. Moments later, a new creature emerged, part man, part machine, its glowing eyes devoid of humanity. Evelyn gagged, turning away, but Marcus couldn't tear his eyes from the horrific spectacle. "We have to destroy it," Reeves muttered, his face pale. "How?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "That thing isn't just a machine, it's alive. It's growing. You can't just blow it up and call it a day." Reeves shook his head. "We'll call in an airstrike. Level the whole damn area." "No," Marcus snapped, his voice sharper than intended. "If we destroy it without understanding it, we lose any chance of stopping this from happening elsewhere. We need to figure out what it's doing, how it works." Reeves stared at him as though he were insane. "You want to study that thing?" "I want to survive," Marcus shot back. The argument was cut short by the sound of scuttling behind them. One of the biomechanical creatures had spotted the group, its elongated limbs skittering across the ground with inhuman speed. Reeves and his men opened fire, but the bullets seemed to do little more than slow it down. "Fall back!" Reeves shouted, unloading a grenade launcher into the creature. The explosion sent it reeling, but it didn't stop. As they retreated, Marcus glanced back at the flesh forge, its maw open wide, exhaling a plume of dark, smoky vapor. For a brief moment he thought he could see shapes in the smoke, faces screaming silently. The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible but insistent. Even as the team escaped the zone, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had latched onto his mind, a parasite burrowing deep into his thoughts. The forge was more than a machine. It was a predator, and Earth was its prey. The bunker was suffocatingly quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of failing fluorescent lights. Dr. Marcus Halstead hunched over a table strewn with maps, satellite images, and pages of scrawled notes. His team was smaller now. Many had been lost or fled, unwilling to face what lay ahead. Those who remained shared a grim determination, their faces pale and haggard. "We've tracked the signals to the largest zone," Evelyn said, her voice thin with exhaustion. She pointed to a satellite image on the table. The epicenter was a sprawling biomechanical hive that stretched across what had once been a forest in Eastern Europe. It radiated the same eerie pulses as the flesh forge, but at a far greater intensity. "This is where it started," Marcus murmured, his eyes scanning the images. "The signals we picked up weeks ago, the ones that led the Horde here, they're all coming from this location." "And you think the source is there?" asked Reeves, the soldier who had reluctantly joined them after the Montana mission. "I don't think," Marcus replied, his voice grim. "I know." The decision to infiltrate the zone was not made lightly. Every report from survivors painted a picture of a living nightmare, the air choked with the stench of decay and chemicals, the ground pulsating as if alive. But the alternative, doing nothing, meant extinction. They set out under the cover of night, their convoy moving through abandoned towns and landscapes twisted by the Horde's spread. The roads grew impassable, forcing them to proceed on foot. The closer they came to the epicenter, the more the world changed. Trees had been absorbed into the biomechanical growths, their trunks warped into grotesque shapes that glistened with a mixture of sap and machine oil. The ground squelched beneath their boots, oozing a viscous black liquid. As they neared the hive, the whispers returned, more insistent and invasive than ever. Marcus felt them clawing at the edges of his thoughts, urging him to stop, to turn back, to give in. He shook his head violently, trying to clear his mind, but the sensation persisted. The hive itself was a towering mass of organic and mechanical matter, its surface alive with movement. Tendrils coiled and uncoiled like the tentacles of some deep-sea creature, and every so often something would crawl out, a new creation birthed from the hive's unholy process. "Dear God," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. At the heart of the hive lay the source of it all. It was a cocoon, roughly the size of a bus, suspended in the air by a network of pulsating cables and veins. Its surface was translucent, revealing a shifting, writhing form inside. It was the same color as the biomechanical growths, black and metallic, with veins of glowing, sickly green light. "That's it," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "That's what's controlling the Horde. It's alive." Reeves raised his weapon. "We take it out, everything else dies with it." "It's not that simple," Marcus countered. "Look at it, it's evolving. If we destroy it without understanding it, we might trigger something worse." Before anyone could respond, the cocoon pulsed, emitting a low-frequency hum that made the ground tremble. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his head, and for a moment he was overwhelmed by visions, not his own, but those of the cocoon. He saw stars, vast and cold, and an endless swarm of creatures like the ones invading Earth. He saw worlds consumed, stripped of their identity and remade into biomechanical hives. "It's sending a signal," Marcus gasped, clutching his temples. "It's calling for reinforcements." Reeves didn't hesitate. "We don't have time for science, Halstead. If we don't stop this now, we're done." As if in response to their presence, the hive began to react. Tendrils lashed out from the walls, and creatures swarmed from hidden recesses, their glowing eyes locking onto the intruders. "Open fire!" Reeves barked, unloading his rifle into the oncoming wave. The air erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through the creatures, but they kept coming, their bodies seemingly designed to withstand damage. One of the tendrils snaked toward Marcus, wrapping around his leg and dragging him toward the cocoon. He screamed, clawing at the ground, until Evelyn severed the tendril with a blowtorch she had carried from the convoy. "We can't hold them off forever," she shouted, her voice hoarse. Marcus stared at the cocoon, its pulsations growing faster, more frantic. He knew Reeves was right. They had no choice. "Plant the charges," Marcus yelled. Reeves and his team moved quickly, placing explosives around the base of the cocoon, while Evelyn and Marcus provided cover. The creatures swarmed closer, their screeches mingling with the hum of the hive. As the last charge was set, the cocoon split slightly, revealing the creature within. It was serpentine, its body covered in metallic plates that shifted like scales. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence, and as it turned toward Marcus, he felt a presence in his mind, a voice, ancient and cold. "You think this will stop us?" the voice whispered, not in words but in thoughts. "We are infinite. We are inevitable." The charges detonated, drowning out everything else in a deafening roar. Marcus was thrown backward, the heat of the explosion singeing his skin. When he opened his eyes, the cocoon was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater. The hive trembled violently, its tendrils convulsing before falling limp. The creatures collapsed, their bodies disintegrating into piles of inert metal and decayed flesh. The whispers stopped, leaving a silence that was almost more terrifying than the noise. As the survivors regrouped outside the zone, Marcus stared at the horizon. The source of the Horde was destroyed, but he couldn't shake the vision he had seen. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The sky above the hive was no longer the dull, gray overcast they had seen before. Now it burned with streaks of red and black, the atmosphere itself seeming to rot under the influence of the biomechanical infection. Tendrils of smoke curled upward from the hive's remains, but Marcus Halstead knew it wasn't over. The hive's collapse had been temporary, a wound, not a kill. Something deeper still pulsed beneath the surface, something the detonation hadn't reached. "We can't leave," Marcus said, his voice strained. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow, and his breathing was labored. Evelyn knelt beside him, wrapping a bandage around her own scorched arm. "We don't have the manpower for this," Captain Reeves growled, his weapon hanging limply in his hands. His face was smeared with ash, and his eyes looked hollow. "The hive's dead. We've done enough." Marcus pointed toward the ground. The earth beneath them was shifting, rumbling with an unholy rhythm. "Number, we've only taken out the shell. The real threat is below us." As if to confirm his words, the ground buckled, throwing them all to the ground. A deafening roar erupted, and from the crater where the cocoon had been, something massive began to emerge. It was the same serpentine creature Marcus had seen inside the cocoon, but now it was free, its size beyond comprehension. Segments of its metallic body glistened with a sickly green light, and its tendrils stretched for miles, tearing through the remaining structures of the hive like paper. "It survived," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "No," Marcus replied, his heart pounding. "It's waking up." The creature's head loomed above them, its molten eyes scanning the ground below. It let out a sound that was neither a roar nor a scream, but something in between, a sound that seemed to resonate in their bones, in their very souls. Around them, the earth cracked open, and smaller creatures began to emerge, their forms writhing and twisting in unnatural ways. "We're out of time," Reeves shouted, raising his rifle and firing wildly. The bullets barely scratched the creature's hide. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. "We need to finish this. We need to hit it where it's weakest." "And where the hell is that?" Reeves barked, backing away as one of the smaller creatures lunged at him. "The core," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Every living thing has a heart, even this abomination." The team regrouped as best they could, their weapons nearly useless against the onslaught of smaller creatures. Marcus led them toward the epicenter, where the creature's massive body coiled around a pulsating structure buried deep in the earth. The air grew hotter, thicker as they descended, the vibrations beneath their feet intensifying. The core was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. It was a massive sphere, half metal, half flesh, suspended by a network of glowing tendrils. It beat like a heart, each pulse sending waves of energy through the ground. The serpentine creature coiled protectively around it, its glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. "There," Marcus shouted. "That's its weak point." Reeves nodded grimly. "We've got one shot at this." He handed Marcus a pack of high-yield explosives. "Get to the core. We'll cover you." "No," Evelyn said, stepping forward. "I'll go. You're the only one who understands this thing, Marcus. If this doesn't work, you need to figure out what's next." Before Marcus could argue, Evelyn grabbed the explosives and ran toward the core. The creature roared, its massive body lurching to intercept her. Reeves and the others opened fire, drawing its attention, but it was relentless. Evelyn dodged its thrashing tendrils, her movements quick and precise despite the chaos around her. "Come on," Marcus shouted, his voice hoarse. "You can do this." Evelyn reached the base of the core, her figure dwarfed by its immense size. She placed the explosives, her hands trembling, and activated the timer. The creature seemed to sense what was happening. It lunged toward her, its massive jaws opening wide. Evelyn turned back to Marcus one last time, a small, sad smile on her face. "Take it down," she whispered. The explosion was blinding, a deafening roar that shook the entire zone. Marcus was thrown backward, the heat of the blast scorching his skin. When he opened his eyes, the core was gone, obliterated, and the creature's massive body lay crumpled, its tendrils twitching weakly before going still. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. It was over. Marcus stumbled to his feet, his ears ringing. Reeves and the few remaining survivors emerged from the smoke, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. But Evelyn was gone. They stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the smoldering crater where the core had been. The weight of their victory was almost too much to bear, the cost too high. As they made their way back to the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the back of his mind, a faint echo of the whispers, a reminder that the Horde had not come to Earth by chance. This was only the first wave, and somewhere out in the vast, cold darkness of space, they were still watching, waiting. Marcus tightened his grip on the strap of his pack, his jaw set. He didn't know when they would return, but he knew one thing for certain. Next time, humanity would be ready.